A homeless woman saved the daughter of a man worth $1.3 trillion. The shocking part, she never knew she did it. And the billionaire whose daughter's life she helped save wouldn't learn her name until years later. By then, it was almost too late. Because this isn't just a story about money, it's a story about sacrifice, about gratitude, and about a woman the world had forgotten. A woman who kept giving when she had almost nothing left to give. Her name was Margaret Cole. For 3 years, Margaret followed the exact same routine. Every 56 days, without fail, she walked into the same building in Columbus, Ohio, sat in the same chair, rolled up her sleeve, and gave away something she could never get back. Nobody paid her, nobody celebrated her, nobody even noticed her. Most people who passed Margaret on the street never looked twice. She slept in a shelter, she wore donated clothes. Everything she owned fit inside a single worn canvas bag. Yet somehow, despite having almost nothing, she never stopped giving. Nobody knew why, nobody asked. And that is exactly what makes what happened next so extraordinary. Because 412 miles away, a little girl named Lily Voss was fighting for her life. And her father, Raymond Voss, was a man who could buy almost anything on earth. Private islands, corporate empires, entire city skylines. But there was one thing all of his money couldn't buy. The one thing his daughter desperately needed: time. There is a kind of person in this world who gives without keeping score, who shows up without being asked, who pours from whatever they have left in the vessel, even when the vessel is nearly empty, even when the world around them has gone completely quiet and nobody is watching, and there is no reasonable expectation that any of it will ever come back to them in any form. Most of us have met someone like that at least once in our lives. A parent, maybe. A neighbor. A colleague who stayed late for no reason anybody could articulate. We recognize them when we see them. And then almost always we forget them, we move on, we get busy. We assume they will always be there, giving in their quiet way, and we never stop long enough to ask what it costs them. We never think to ask what they might need. This is a story about what happens when someone finally asks. Her name was Margaret Cole, and on the morning of March the 9th, 2021, she woke up on a narrow cot in a shelter on 4th Street in Columbus, Ohio, folded the thin blanket the way the staff asked residents to fold it, and walked 4 blocks through air so cold it burned the inside of her nose, to a blood center on Broad Street. She had nothing in her pockets except a small laminated card with her donor identification number on it, and a folded piece of paper with the address written in her own handwriting. Not because she had forgotten the address after the first visit, but because carrying the paper felt like carrying a reason. She sat down in a blue plastic chair in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and bad coffee, filled out her paperwork in the careful print of a woman who had spent 2 decades filling out medical forms professionally, and waited her turn. Nobody in that room knew who she was. Nobody in that room knew what she had lost to get there. And in a few minutes, when they called her name and she sat down in the donor chair and rolled up the sleeve of a coat that did not belong to her, nobody in that room had any way of knowing that the blood leaving her arm was about to travel 412 miles northeast to save the life of a child whose father was worth more money than the annual budget of most countries on earth. 412 miles northeast of Columbus, in a private room on the 14th floor of New York Presbyterian Hospital in Manhattan, a 9-year-old girl named Lily Voss was running out of time in the quiet, clinical way that hospital emergencies actually unfold. Without drama, without warning, with only the steady mechanical language of monitors and the controlled urgency of medical professionals who are trained to keep their faces calm even when the situation is not. Lily had been flown in from upstate New York on a private jet the previous evening after collapsing during a school field trip to a nature preserve outside Albany. The initial assessment on the flight had pointed toward a cardiac event. The full diagnosis, delivered at 2 in the morning by a hematologist who had been called in specifically for this case, was a rare autoimmune blood disorder that had been developing silently for years, completely undetected, and was now in acute crisis. The treatment protocol was clear. The prognosis with proper intervention was excellent. But the intervention required AB-negative blood. And the hospital's supply of AB-negative was, at that precise moment, critically and dangerously low. Raymond Voss had been awake for 31 hours by the time the hematologist delivered that diagnosis. He had been sitting beside Lily's bed for most of that time, holding her hand when she was awake and watching the rise and fall of her chest when she slept. He was not a man who showed fear in conventional ways. The people who worked for him described him as composed to the point of appearing cold. He ran billion-dollar meetings without visible emotion. He made decisions that affected entire industries without hesitation. Over 3 decades, he had built an enterprise employing hundreds of thousands of people across 6 continents. Every crisis that had ever threatened his empire had eventually yielded to intelligence, influence, money, or persistence. But sitting beside his daughter's hospital bed at 3 in the morning, Raymond Voss was not an executive. He was not a billionaire. He was not a public figure. He was a father. and that is a completely different thing. When the attending physician explained the blood supply situation at approximately 4:15 in the morning, Raymond asked only one question: "What are you doing about it?" The physician explained that emergency dispatch requests had already been sent to every registered blood center within 500 miles. The requests had been flagged at the highest priority level. Logistics teams were already coordinating transportation. Every available option was being explored. Raymond nodded once, said thank you, then sat back down beside Lily's bed. A few moments later, he picked up his phone and called his chief of staff, Frank Dellinger. For 15 years, Frank had solved problems most people would consider impossible. But this wasn't a business problem. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't something that could be purchased. Still, Raymond instructed him to contact every medical supply connection they had and legally accelerate whatever could be accelerated. Frank promised he would. Then the call ended. Raymond placed the phone face down on the arm of the chair, looked at his sleeping daughter, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt completely powerless. He had done everything he could do. Everything else was now in someone else's hands. What Raymond Voss did not know was that those hands belonged to a woman who slept in a homeless shelter. A woman sitting quietly in a blue plastic chair in Columbus, Ohio. A woman wearing a donated coat. A woman carrying a worn canvas bag. A woman nobody in that room would have recognized if she disappeared tomorrow. Margaret Cole. She knew nothing about Lily Voss, nothing about Raymond Voss, nothing about private jets, billion-dollar corporations, or emergency medical briefings in Manhattan. She didn't know that an urgent dispatch request had arrived at the blood center that morning. She didn't know that doctors were counting minutes. She didn't know that somewhere a father was praying for a miracle. She knew only one thing: she had AB-negative blood. And a notice pinned to the shelter bulletin board had said AB-negative donors were urgently needed. For Margaret, that was enough. It had always been enough. So when her name was called, she stood up, walked into the donation room, rolled up her sleeve, and quietly made a decision that would change two lives forever. One belonged to a little girl she would never meet. The other belonged to a man whose wealth could buy almost anything except the gift she was about to give freely. Neither of them knew it yet, but the course of their lives had just intersected. And the truth Raymond Voss would eventually uncover about Margaret Cole over the next 3 years would leave him questioning everything he thought he understood about generosity, sacrifice, and the true value of a human life. And what happened over the next 3 years would become a story so extraordinary, so emotional, and so unexpected that it would change both of their lives forever. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the greatest acts of generosity often come from the people who have the least to give. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Margaret Cole ended up in that shelter, you have to go back to a place that most of the country stopped paying attention to a long time ago. A small town in central Ohio called Millbrook, population 4,000. One traffic light, a diner, a hardware store, and a high school football team that was, by the account of anyone who grew up there, the primary civic religion of the community from August through November every year. Millbrook was the kind of American town that had been built around a manufacturing base that thrived in the decades after World War II and spent the years that followed quietly contracting as that base eroded, the way hundreds of towns across the industrial Midwest eroded. Not all at once, not while with drama, steadily and without announcement, the way a river changes course. So gradually that the people living beside it sometimes do not notice until the bank they were standing on is no longer where it used to be. The people who stayed in Millbrook after the contraction were not people who lacked options. Many of them were people who had made a deliberate choice to stay in the place they were from because they believed that place deserved people who would stay. And because the life that staying offered, embedded in a community where people knew each other and looked after each other and showed up without being asked, was a life worth choosing, even when the economic argument pointed somewhere else. Margaret's father, Robert Williams, was one of those people. He had grown up in Millbrook himself, the son of a factory worker who had come back from Korea and gone straight to the floor of the same manufacturing plant that employed most of the men in town. Robert had broken from that path not by leaving, but by earning a partial academic scholarship, going to college, and coming back with a teaching degree, which in Millbrook in the 1960s was its own version of ambition, its own way of making something of yourself without abandoning the place that made you. He taught 8th grade history and social studies at Millbrook Middle School for 31 years, and every former student who was later asked about him said approximately the same thing without coordinating their answers. He was the kind of teacher who made you feel like the subject mattered because he made you feel like you mattered. He had a quality of patient, genuine attention to the person in front of him that was not a professional method or a classroom technique. It was simply who he was. It was so deeply who he was that his daughter inherited it so completely that people who knew both of them would sometimes stop mid-sentence when they noticed it in her, and just say she is exactly like her father, and mean it as the only description that was fully sufficient. Dorothy Williams, Margaret's mother, was a different kind of force entirely. Where Robert was patient and methodical and drawn to the long view, Dorothy was practical and immediate and deeply, almost constitutionally unsentimental about the difference between what a person wanted and what a person actually needed. She worked part-time at a fabric store on Main Street 3 days a week, not because the family strictly required the income, but because Dorothy Williams was not a woman built for sitting still, and the fabric store kept her in daily contact with the life of the community in ways she found sustaining. She was, by the account of everyone in Millbrook who knew her, the person other people called first when something went wrong. Not the most prominent person in town. Not the one whose name appeared in the newspaper, the most reliably present, the one who showed up before you finished explaining that something had happened. If a neighbor lost his job, Dorothy Williams was at the door with food before the news had finished traveling down the street. If a family needed a ride to the doctor 40 minutes away and had no car, Dorothy drove them there, waited, drove them home, and did not make a story of it afterward. She did these things in the matter-of-fact way of someone who decided, a long time ago, what people are for, and who has never had reason to revisit that decision. Margaret watched all of this every day of her childhood, not in the way children observe occasional significant events. In the daily, granular, unremarkable way that character actually passes between generations through 1,000 small actions that nobody labels as lessons because they are simply life, and they absorb into a child the way water absorbs into ground, invisibly, completely, permanently. She decided she wanted to be a nurse before she was old enough to articulate fully why, and when she was old enough to articulate it, she said that nursing was the most direct line she could find between who she was and what the world needed. She enrolled in the nursing program at Columbus State Community College in the fall of 1987, worked 2 part-time jobs to cover her living expenses, shared an apartment near campus with 2 classmates, and graduated in 1991 with a clinical education that was supplemented by something that could not be taught in any classroom, which was a lifelong, daily first-hand understanding of the relationship between poverty and health and the specific ways in which the inability to access basic care early creates catastrophic crises later. She had done her clinical rotations in working-class and Columbus neighborhoods where the emergency rooms absorbed, on any given night, the accumulated health consequences of years of deferred treatment, conditions that had been growing quietly in people's bodies for years because those people could not afford to address them until they became emergencies that the system had no choice but to treat at maximum cost to everyone involved. She carried that understanding with her into every shift she ever worked, not as an abstraction, but as a lived knowledge. A knowledge that shaped the way she looked at every person who came through a door in crisis. Not as a problem, as a person, always as a person first. She was hired by Riverside Methodist Hospital almost immediately after graduation. Her hiring manager, a supervising nurse named Barbara Hodges, who had been running her unit for 12 years, and who had interviewed more candidates than she could accurately recall, said the reason she hired Margaret on the spot was the answer she gave to the last question of every interview she conducted. The question she considered the most revealing of any she asked. The question was, what part of this work do you think you will find the hardest? Most candidates named a clinical challenge, a procedural difficulty, the stress of a high patient load. Margaret Williams looked across the desk and said, the hardest part is going to be leaving. Going home at the end of a shift and leaving patients behind. Barbara Hodges hired her before the interview was technically concluded. She would later say it was the best hiring decision she made in 12 years of running that unit. Margaret started on a general medical floor, as all new nurses do, and requested a transfer to the trauma ward after 18 months. The trauma ward was the hardest assignment in the hospital, the place where the most severe cases arrived at the most unpredictable hours, demanding the most from everyone working them. Most nurses who rotated through the trauma ward requested different assignments. Margaret requested it permanently. When Barbara asked her why, she said, the trauma ward is where people need the most help the fastest. I want to be where that is. She was transferred. She worked the overnight shift on that ward for 22 straight years. And what she became in those years, in the accumulated knowledge and steadiness of 2 decades of the hardest nursing in the hospital, was the person you wanted in the room when everything was going wrong. Not because she was the loudest voice or the most technically brilliant presence, though her technical skills were excellent. Because she had what the most experienced emergency physicians she worked with described as contagious calm, the ability to lower the anxiety level of an entire room simply by the quality of her own response to the crisis unfolding inside it. She communicated, without words, that the situation was going to be managed because she was there and she knew what to do and she was not leaving. New residents who trained alongside her said that watching her work taught them something they could not find in any textbook or simulation, something about what it meant to be present in a room where someone needed everything you had, to give everything you had without being consumed by the giving. Barbara Hodges wrote in one of her annual performance reviews a single line that was later quoted more than once by people trying to explain who Margaret Cole was to people who had never met her. The line was, "She does not treat patients as problems to be solved. She treats them as people who are having the worst day of their lives." That is not a clinical skill. It is a character trait, and it cannot be taught. She met Dennis Cole at a 4th of July barbecue in the summer of 1995, at the home of a colleague from Riverside Methodist in the Clintonville neighborhood of Columbus. Dennis was 33 years old, a mechanic who owned a single-bay shop on the near west side of the city that he had built from the ground up over 6 years of very early mornings and very late evenings, and a standard of quality that his customers recognized from the first invoice and that kept them coming back. He was not a man who needed to be the most interesting person at a gathering. He was not loud or flashy or particularly interested in being noticed. He was the kind of man other men instinctively described as solid, which is a word that sounds simple until you think carefully about what it actually means, about what it costs a person to be consistently honest and reliable and present over a long period of time, about how rare that consistency actually is, and how much of what breaks down in the world breaks down precisely because someone who was supposed to be solid turned out not to be when the real pressure came. Dennis Cole was solid in the way that a load-bearing wall is solid. The kind of solid you do not think about because it has never given you a reason to. What Margaret noticed first in the noise and social motion of that 4th of July gathering was that Dennis listened to people all the way to the end of what they were saying before he responded, not performing attention while constructing his reply, the way most people do, actually listening, receiving the full content of what was being said and sitting with it for a genuine moment before he spoke. She had spent 4 years on a trauma ward where communication moved at speed and interruption was practically a professional norm, and she had forgotten, or perhaps never fully known, what it felt like to be heard by someone who was actually hearing you. She talked to Dennis Cole for 2 hours that evening without meaning to and drove home afterward thinking about the quality of his attention in a way that felt like the recognition of something important, like the feeling of finding something you did not know you had been looking for. She was right about that. They dated for 2 years. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in March of 1997 in the kitchen of his apartment while she was washing the dinner dishes and he was drying them. He set down his dish towel, turned to her, and said he would like to spend the rest of his life doing dishes with her if that was agreeable to her. She said it was. They were married 4 months later in a small ceremony at a church near Millbrook with perhaps 60 people in attendance, none of whom later described it as anything other than exactly the wedding that suited both of them, direct and genuine, and finished quickly so the real part could start. They bought the house on Elm Ridge Drive in 1999, a 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow that needed work, and that Dennis spent the first 2 years addressing with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to every significant undertaking. He fixed the foundation drainage. He replaced the windows. He rebuilt the back porch that had been deteriorating since before they moved in. He planted a vegetable garden in the side yard that produced more tomatoes every summer than 2 people could reasonably eat, and that he distributed to neighbors without making anything of it, because that was simply what you did. Margaret left the garden entirely to him because she had no aptitude for it, and they both knew it, and neither made it into a problem, which is the mark of a marriage that has found its actual shape rather than the shape it was supposed to have. Through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Margaret's career at Riverside Methodist continued to deepen in ways that went beyond the accumulation of experience. She had become, by her early 30s, the kind of nurse that physicians specifically requested for difficult overnight shifts, and her reputation within the hospital had grown to the point where her name came up in conversations she was not part of, among staff who wanted to understand what made a specific approach to emergency nursing different from what most people were doing. She was not ambitious in the self-promotional sense. She was not working toward a title or a corner office or a salary tier that would make a resume look impressive. She was working toward better outcomes for the people in front of her, and everything else followed from that with a naturalness that people around her sometimes mistook for ease, not understanding that the steadiness they were observing was the product of years of deliberate practice and genuine sacrifice, and a commitment that was renewed, implicitly, at the beginning of every shift. She and Dennis did not have children, a decision reached together in the early years of their marriage, through quiet, unhurried conversations that were characteristic of how they navigated most significant things. They were not opposed to children. They were both, in their different ways, deeply invested in the young people around them, Dennis through his volunteer coaching of youth football teams on weekends, Margaret through the specific investment she brought to every young patient who came through her ward. But the life they had built was full and meaningful, and they were at peace with it in a way that required no defense and invited no apology. When their friends raised the subject with the gentle persistence that people who have made the opposite choice sometimes bring to it, both Dennis and Margaret had the same response, a smile and a change of subject. Because the decision had been made and there was nothing further that needed to be said about it. By 2015, they had paid off the mortgage on Elm Ridge Drive 3 years ahead of schedule through a combination of Dennis's careful financial management and Margaret's overtime shifts. They had a retirement account that was not large but was growing. They took one trip a year, usually within driving distance, the Smoky Mountains twice, a long weekend in Chicago that Margaret loved, and Dennis found overwhelming in the particular way that people raised in small Ohio towns find large cities overwhelming, not unpleasantly, but with a sustained alertness that was tiring to maintain. They had a dinner rotation with a small circle of friends, mostly neighbors and former colleagues of Margaret's, that had been running so long it had become one of those comfortable, self-perpetuating institutions that nobody could quite remember starting. They had the life that most Americans spend their working years trying to build, not lavish, not spectacular, solid, real, theirs. Built from honest work and mutual respect and the daily practice of two people choosing each other without drama or announcement. Now here is where this story turns. And I want you to pay close attention to what happens next, because what happens to Margaret and Dennis Cole is not a story about bad luck or poor decisions or individual failure. It is a story about what the American system does to families when one member gets sick, and it is a story that is playing out right now, today, in hundreds of thousands of homes across this country, in silence, without anyone making a documentary about it, without anyone making a foundation in their name. What happened to them is ordinary. That is the most important thing to understand about it. It is ordinary. And that should make every one of us uncomfortable. Dennis Cole noticed the weakness in his right hand in the spring of 2017. He mentioned it to Margaret the way you mention something you have already decided is probably nothing, over dinner casually, in the tone of a man who is raising the subject primarily because the nurse across the table will either confirm it is nothing or tell him to get it checked. Margaret asked her questions with the focused precision of a medical professional assessing a situation she is trying not to fully assess yet. How long? Whether constant or intermittent, whether accompanied by pain. He answered each question with the slightly impatient patience of a man going through a process he considers unnecessary, but who is willing to go through it out of respect for his wife's professional concern. She told him to make an appointment. He made it 3 weeks later, because Dennis Cole was not a man who prioritized his own medical care with urgency. The doctor found nothing immediately alarming and attributed the symptom to possible nerve compression from 30 years of physical-mechanical work, and recommended follow-up if it persisted or worsened. It persisted. It worsened. By the fall of 2017, the weakness had spread to his left hand, and he had begun experiencing involuntary muscle twitching in his forearms that came and went without warning, and that he had started concealing from Margaret with the specific care of a man who does not want to worry his wife, which meant Margaret had noticed it within a week and was choosing not to push, because she was not yet ready to say out loud what the combination of symptoms she was cataloging in the back of her clinical mind was beginning to add up to. She had 26 years on a trauma ward. She knew what she was looking at. She needed a little more time before she was willing to look at it directly. The referral to a neurologist came in January of 2018. The specialist doctor, Paul Mercer at Ohio State University Medical Center, ran the tests that a neurologist runs in that clinical situation with the systematic thoroughness of someone who has a working hypothesis and is building the evidence to confirm or refute it. Margaret sat in the examination room through every step of the process and watched with the dual attention of a medical professional who understood each test and what it measured, and a wife of 20 years who could read her husband's face with a precision that no diagnostic instrument could replicate. Dr. Mercer asked them to come back the following week for the results discussion. They drove home with less conversation than was usual between them. That evening, after Dennis had gone to bed, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she did not drink and thought about what she already knew and had not yet said. She sat there for a long time. Then she went to bed, because there was nothing to be done with knowledge until it was official, and because Dennis was asleep, and being awake alone with that particular knowledge was not making anything better. The diagnosis of ALS was delivered on a Thursday afternoon in February of 2018 in a consultation room at Ohio State University Medical Center. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease. A progressive neurodegenerative disease that destroys the nerve cells controlling voluntary muscle movement. No cure, no reversal. Variable timeline between patients but a fixed and unalterable direction of travel. Dennis Cole was 61 years old. A man who had spent his entire adult life using his hands and his body to build and repair and maintain things, who had coached young athletes on weekends, who had rebuilt a porch and planted a garden and laid his hands on engines and made them run right, was going to watch the body he had always relied on stop cooperating with the person inside it. Dr. Mercer was thorough and direct, and as compassionate as a man can be when delivering information that has no soft version. Dennis listened to everything with the quality of attention he brought to all important information. He asked 2 questions when the doctor finished. The first was about the timeline. Mercer said it varied considerably and that some patients lived for many years with proper management. The second question was whether he could still drive. Dr. Mercer said yes for now. Dennis nodded. He thanked the doctor. He stood up, took Margaret's hand, and walked out of the building with the measured steadiness of a man who has decided, before the full weight of what he has just heard has landed, how he is going to carry it forward. That decision, made in the corridor of a medical building on a Thursday afternoon in February, said everything about who Dennis Cole was and had always been. They sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes before either of them spoke. Margaret went first. She said his name in the way she said it when something required everything. Not with alarm, but with the fullness of a person bringing their complete attention to a moment that deserved nothing less. And Dennis Cole, who had not cried in front of another person since his father's funeral 14 years earlier, cried. Not for long. With the contained efficiency of a man who understands that there is a limit to what crying accomplishes and who intends to reach that limit and then move past it, because there was work to be done and crying was not the work. He wiped his eyes with the back of one of his large, already weakening hands. He looked at her. He said, "We are going to be okay." She looked back at him and said, "Yes, we are." She was not performing comfort. She was not managing his emotional state with a professional technique borrowed from her clinical practice. She was making a commitment, and she had already, in those 40 minutes in the parking garage, understood the full dimensions of what that commitment meant. She was going to be there, all the way through, without conditions and without visible breaking point. She was going to do this the same way she had done everything that mattered in her life, completely honestly, without asking anyone to notice. She kept that commitment without exception for 1,095 days. Not one of those days was easy. She never made it anyone else's problem. The financial picture that unfolded over those 3 years is the part of this story that the most people in this country will recognize most personally. Because what happened to Margaret and Dennis Cole is not unusual. That is not a figure of speech, and it is not an exaggeration. Medical debt is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States, accounting for the majority of filings every single year, and the overwhelming majority of those filings are not made by people who were careless with money or irresponsible with their resources. They are made by people who did everything right and got sick anyway, or who loved someone who got sick, and who discovered that doing everything right is not, in America, a guarantee of protection against the specific catastrophe of a serious diagnosis in a system that will treat you and simultaneously bill you in ways that are designed for no human budget to absorb. Margaret and Dennis had what most people would consider solid insurance coverage through Riverside Methodist. What they discovered in the first months after the diagnosis is what anyone who has been inside a complex long-term illness in this country tends to discover. That the policy they believed they had and the coverage that actually materialized when they needed it were meaningfully different things, separated by a distance measured in co-payments and coverage limitations and billing codes and appeal processes and line items that seemed small individually and were devastating collectively. The medications approved for ALS treatment in the United States are expensive in the way that medications with small patient populations and no generic alternatives are expensive, which is to say at a level that is difficult to describe without the numbers starting to feel abstract. The specialized equipment required as the disease progressed, the power wheelchair, the hospital-grade adjustable bed, the communication device, the respiratory support system that became necessary in the final year, each of these items cost more than most people spend on a vehicle and was covered partially by insurance, sometimes generously partially, sometimes not, with the coverage shrinking as the billing categories shifted from acute to chronic and the insurance company's internal systems recategorized accordingly. The in-home care that became necessary when Dennis reached the point where he could no longer be safely managed without professional assistance cost more per month than their mortgage had, and was covered at a rate that left a balance each month that accumulated with the quiet, compounding patience of a debt that knows it has nowhere to be and all the time in the world. Margaret tracked everything in a spreadsheet she reviewed every Sunday evening with the focused grimness of someone doing a wound assessment, noting the extent of the damage without allowing herself to flinch, because flinching did not help Dennis and it did not help the spreadsheet. She took every overtime shift available at Riverside Methodist. She cashed out the smaller retirement account in 2019 to cover a gap the insurance declined to fill following an appeal process that took 4 months and succeeded partially and still left a balance that the billing department needed paid. She filed a second appeal simultaneously while using the retirement funds to ensure service was not interrupted, because interrupting Dennis's care was not an option she was willing to consider regardless of what it cost her. She did not discuss any of this with her colleagues, because she was not a person who brought her personal circumstances into the professional space, and because there was a specific and deeply held conviction involved that was not pride in the self-congratulatory sense but something more serious. A belief that her own difficulties were not of sufficient magnitude to warrant the attention she would have to draw away from patients to receive. That conviction had been one of her greatest strengths for 30 years. In the context of what was actually happening to her family, it was costing her something she did not yet know she was running out of. Dennis's condition moved through 2019 and into 2020 with the particular character of ALS, which does not decline in a straight line but in a series of descents, each one a new baseline, a new calibration of what life looked like now and what adjustments were required to keep living it with dignity. Dennis made each adjustment with the same quality of quiet, uncomplaining steadiness that had defined him for as long as Margaret had known him, and longer by the account of everyone who had known him before her. He lost the fine motor capacity of his hands for detailed mechanical work in the early summer of 2020. He closed the shop on the near west side methodically, settling every account, making sure Carlos received what he was owed and then more, locking the door on a Thursday afternoon in August for the last time without ceremony, because he had said what needed to be said and adding to it would not have served anyone. He transitioned to a walker in the fall, to a wheelchair by the end of the year. He lost some clarity of speech, not completely but enough that conversation required more patience in both directions. And he and Margaret developed over those months a private language of expression and gesture that communicated what words could no longer fully carry, a language that only the two of them fully understood, the specific vocabulary of a long marriage condensed, by necessity, into something smaller and more essential and no less complete. He kept his humor, he kept his ability to listen. He sat in his wheelchair in the kitchen while Margaret cooked, because he had always liked being in the kitchen while food was being made, liked the presence of it, and she talked to him about her shifts and her colleagues and the manageable things that were happening in the world beyond Elm Ridge Drive, because talking kept the silence from becoming something with too much weight in it, and because Dennis Cole had always been the best listener she had ever known, and she needed, more than she had words to describe, to be in a room with someone who was genuinely hearing her. He died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2021, in the bedroom on Elm Ridge Drive with Margaret beside him. He was 64 years old. She sat with him for a while after he was gone, not doing anything, not performing grief for anyone who might be watching because nobody was watching, just sitting with him the way she had sat with him every night for 23 years, present and still in there. Then she stood up and handled everything that needed to be handled with the practical, steady competence that was her nature. And when everything had been done, she sat at the kitchen table for the third time in 3 years with a cup of tea she did not drink, and she allowed herself for a private and finite period of time to feel the full weight of what she had just lost. Then she stood up, washed the cup, went to bed. The next morning she began the accounting. The financial picture was what it was. $287,000 in outstanding medical debt across 17 providers, $94,000 remaining on the second mortgage, $61,000 in remaining retirement savings, property taxes due in the spring. She laid it all out on a legal pad one evening, assessed it with the same clear-eyed thoroughness she brought to every difficult situation she had ever faced, looked at the number at the bottom of the page, and then turned the pad face down and went to wash the dishes. She called a bankruptcy attorney in April. She sat in the waiting room for 20 minutes before she went in, feeling something that rational knowledge could not fully dissolve, because shame does not primarily operate in the rational register and does not primarily respond to rational argument, even when the argument is completely correct. The attorney, a man named Gerald Simmons, was thorough and kind and competent. He laid out her options clearly. She went home and thought about them. She lost the house in September of 2021. She moved what she could into a storage unit on Morse Road. She drove the last load there on a gray October morning. and stood looking at the roll-down door of the storage unit for a long time. Not because she was about to cry, but because she was trying to fully understand what she was standing in the middle of, the specific distance between where she had been and where she was, and whether the path from one to the other made sense, and how you move forward from a place that did not make sense without losing the thread of who you were. She got back in the car. She drove north on I-71 to stay with her sister Patricia in Cleveland for 3 weeks. That turned out to be the most honest 3 weeks the two of them had shared in years. At the end of those 3 weeks, Margaret told Patricia she had a lead on a position in Columbus and needed to go back. Patricia said she could stay. Margaret said she knew. She went back anyway. The Hope Harbor shelter on 4th Street in Columbus was not where Margaret Cole expected to be at 52. She would have been the first to say that expectation was beside the point. The point was that it was where she was, and where she was required a response. And she responded to it the way she had responded to every difficult situation in her adult life, by assessing what was available and using it without complaint. She filled out the intake forms at Hope Harbor with her full professional credentials listed, her employment gap described accurately and without embellishment, her housing goal stated clearly. She thanked the intake coordinator, a woman named Rosa Diaz, who had been processing intakes for 11 years, and who said later that Margaret's arrival stopped her in a way she had not experienced in her entire tenure at the shelter, not because of what Margaret had lost, but because of the way she was still fully present inside it. Still herself, still paying attention, still there. She was at the shelter for 11 days before she walked to Columbus Regional Blood Center for the first time. The shortage notice on the bulletin board had caught her eye, the way clinical supply information catches the eye of someone trained to notice it, immediately and specifically. AB negative was listed as critically needed. She was AB negative. She knew what that meant operationally. She pushed open the door of the blood center at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning in March of 2021, picked up a clipboard from the front desk, filled out the health questionnaire with the efficiency of someone who understood every question being asked and exactly what was being assessed, handed the clipboard back, was called to the screening room, passed every screening without issue, sat in the donor chair, gave her blood, declined the juice and cookies they offered at the end, thanked the nurse who thanked her back, picked up her canvas bag, and walked out. 56 days later, she came back. 56 days after that, she came back again and again and again. Now we need to talk about Raymond Voss. Not just what he has, because what he has is not the most interesting thing about him. What is interesting about Raymond Voss is the distance between the man he was before his daughter was born and the man he became after. And what that distance tells you about what is actually possible for a person when the right thing comes along and makes everything else seem smaller by comparison. Raymond Voss was born in 1968 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the older of 2 children, the son of a high school mathematics teacher named Edward and a registered nurse named Janet. If you are paying attention to this story, you will have noticed that Raymond Voss, the man who would eventually be worth more money than most countries produce in a year, grew up in a household shaped by exactly the same values that produced Margaret Cole. His father taught mathematics at Scranton High School for 34 years. His mother worked as a registered nurse at Gasinger Medical Center for 31 years. They were not wealthy people. They were people who did necessary things competently and with integrity, and who measured their worth by the quality of what they gave rather than the quantity of what they accumulated. Raymond has mentioned his mother's profession publicly exactly twice in his career, once in a commencement address and once in a healthcare policy discussion, and both times in the same language. His mother was the hardest working person he had ever known in a profession that the country depended on completely and compensated inadequately. That was not a prepared line. It was a conviction that he carried. And it is one of the most important facts about Raymond Voss for understanding what happened when he found Margaret Cole. He grew up in Scranton with the specific formation of a child raised by people who believed that work was its own reward when the work was honest and necessary, that you owed the community more than you took from it, and that the measure of a person was not what they had accumulated, but what they had contributed. He absorbed those values the way Margaret absorbed her mother's, through daily exposure rather than explicit instruction, through the quality of the life being lived around him rather than through the content of any lesson. He was a strong student, methodical and analytical, with a particular affinity for mathematics that he inherited from his father, and that would later prove foundational to the way he built his business. His ability to see quantitative patterns in complex systems that other people looked at and saw only chaos. He attended Penn State on an academic scholarship, studied economics, graduated in the top 5% of his class, and spent 2 years at an investment bank in New York that he has described in one of the rare candid interviews he has given about his early career as the most educational experience of his professional life. not for what it taught him about finance, but for what it taught him about the difference between creating value and extracting it. He understood, within those 2 years, that he was in the extraction business, and that extraction was not what he wanted to build his life around. He left the bank in 1993 at 25 years old with savings from 2 years of investment banking, a thorough understanding of how capital markets functioned, and an idea about the energy sector that he had been developing for 2 years and that his colleagues had listened to politely and not taken seriously. He moved to Houston, spent 6 months learning the operational side of energy infrastructure from a small pipeline company that was willing to hire someone who understood finance better than pipelines, but who was willing to learn fast, and then spent the next 4 years building the foundation of what would become Voss Energy Systems through a combination of small acquisitions, strategic partnerships, and a capacity for sustained work that his early employees described, without exception, as unlike anything they had encountered before. He did not take vacations in those years. He worked every day. He answered every communication within an hour, regardless of when it arrived. He held himself and everyone around him to a standard that was genuinely difficult to meet, not because he was unreasonable, but because his own standard for himself left no room for the accommodations that most people extend to their own performance, and he was not yet emotionally intelligent enough to understand that expecting everyone around him to operate at his register was a form of leadership that produced results in the short term and burned people out in the medium term. He learned that. It took longer than it should have. The learning, when it came from Lily. He married Helen Ashworth in 2001, a woman he met at an energy conference in Houston and who was, in the account of everyone who knew both of them, the right person for him in ways he was not yet fully capable of appreciating. The marriage lasted 9 years and ended in 2010, and Raymond has said on the only occasion he allowed the subject to be discussed that the ending was entirely his fault, by which he did not mean that he had done something dramatic or destructive, but that he had spent 9 years treating the marriage the way he treated everything else, as a system to be efficiently managed, rather than a relationship to be genuinely lived inside. Helen Ashworth is a private person who has maintained that privacy consistently, and the terms of their separation have been observed by both parties without public grievance. What is known is that the co-parenting arrangement they established after the divorce has worked, by Lily's own account and by the account of people who have observed it, in the ways that matter most, which is to say that Lily has grown up with two present, engaged parents who disagreed enough about enough things to separate and who care enough about their daughter to have built something workable out of the disagreement. Lily was born in 2012, and Raymond Voss changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, not in the way that makes for a clean narrative. He changed the way people change when something comes into their life that reorganizes their understanding of what is important and what is not, gradually, through accumulation, through the daily practice of being responsible for someone other than himself for the first time in his adult life, and discovering that the person he was before Lily was a smaller, less complete version of the person he became after. He became more patient. He became genuinely curious about things that had no immediate application to his business. He began to notice, in the specific way of someone whose attention has been redirected to a more human frequency, the experiences of the people around him in ways he had previously processed only as data. He began to think about the distance between what the world was and what it should be, not as an abstract policy question, but as a personal moral concern. The kind that follows you into your morning and sits across the table from you at dinner, and that you cannot reason your way out of because it is not primarily a rational experience. It is a conscience operating at full capacity. Raymond Voss, after Lily, had a conscience operating at full capacity. He had the resources to do something about it. The combination produced a foundation, established in 2016, that focused on workforce development and housing stability in communities near his infrastructure projects, and that was managed by people hired for operational competence rather than fundraising charisma, because Raymond was not interested in a foundation that looked good. He was interested in one that worked. When Lily collapsed during the field trip outside Albany in April of 2021, Raymond was in London for a series of meetings that had been scheduled for months. He was on his private aircraft back to New York within 40 minutes of his Chief of Staff Frank Dellinger's call. He arrived at New York Presbyterian at 11:45 at night. He went directly to Lily's floor and directly to her room and sat down in the chair beside her bed, and did not leave the hospital for the next 38 hours. The people who saw him during those hours described him in terms that were consistent with each other and inconsistent with the Raymond Voss they knew from the professional context. He was not composed. He was not managing the situation from a position of controlled remove. He was a father sitting in a plastic chair beside his daughter's bed in the middle of the night, holding her hand when she was awake, and watching the rise and fall of her breathing when she was not, and bargaining in the private interior language of people who are praying whether or not they are certain they believe in prayer. All the infrastructure he had built, all the capital he had accumulated, all the leverage and connection and capacity that $1.3 trillion makes available to a person. None of it could do anything for Lily that the physicians in that hospital were not already doing. He was, for the first time in a very long time, completely without resources that mattered. He was just a man in a chair. And that was its own kind of education. The hematologist assigned to Lily's case was Dr. Adeza Nwosu, a specialist in autoimmune blood disorders with 15 years of clinical experience who had seen the specific subtype of chronic autoimmune hemolytic anemia she identified in Lily exactly 4 times before in her career, which made her one of the most qualified people in the country to be in that room that night. She was thorough and precise and clear in her communication, which Raymond appreciated with a clarity that he might not have been capable of before Lily taught him what it meant to need someone to be clear with you. The condition was manageable. The prognosis was excellent with proper treatment. But the treatment required AB-negative blood, and the hospital's supply was critically low. Emergency dispatch requests had already gone out to every registered blood center within 500 miles. The logistics team was working the problem at the highest priority level. Raymond asked one question: "What are you doing about it?" He received a thorough answer. He nodded. He went back to Lily's room and sat in his chair and picked up his daughter's hand and held it, because that was what was available to him, and he was going to do it with everything he had. The dispatch request reached Columbus Regional Blood Center at 3:47 in the morning. At that exact moment, Columbus Regional held one of the most substantial AB-negative reserves in the regional network, a supply that Dr. Sandra Okafor had been methodically building for 2 years through a combination of donor recruitment, scheduling precision, and the specific attention she paid to her most consistent contributors. The logistics team at New York Presbyterian identified Columbus Regional as the highest yield source within the required transport window and issued the transfer request immediately. The blood was packaged and dispatched from Columbus that same morning, transported to Columbus International Airport, flown on a chartered medical cargo flight to Teterboro in New Jersey, picked up by courier, and delivered to New York Presbyterian by mid-morning. Lily's transfusion began at 11:15. By early afternoon, her numbers had begun to stabilize in the direction Dr. Nwosu had projected they would with proper intervention. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Lily was awake and asking Raymond if she could have a grilled cheese. He told her of course she could have a grilled cheese. She had the grilled cheese. She fell asleep again. Raymond Voss sat in his chair and looked at his daughter sleeping and felt the specific relief of a man who has been holding his breath for 36 hours and has finally carefully been given permission to exhale. Then he picked up his phone and called Frank Dellinger and said, "I need to know who gave that blood." At that exact moment, 412 miles away, Margaret Cole was walking out of Columbus Regional Blood Center on Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio, having declined the juice and the cookies, having thanked the nurse who thanked her back, having picked up her canvas bag from the chair where she had left it during the donation. She walked out into the April morning thinking about nothing in particular. She did not know where her blood was going. She did not know that 36 hours earlier a 9-year-old girl had collapsed at a nature preserve and been flown to Manhattan. She did not know about Raymond Voss or Lily or New York Presbyterian or the emergency dispatch request. She knew only that she had AB-negative blood, that someone somewhere might need it, and that she had given what she had. She walked back toward the shelter on 4th Street in the morning light, 4 blocks, hands in the pockets of her donated coat. The city of Columbus moved around her without noticing. That is how it had always been. That is how it would continue to be for 3 more years. Dr. Sandra Okafor became aware of Margaret Cole on her second visit to Columbus Regional 56 days after the first. Sandra had been running the center since 2019 and had developed, over 15 years in blood banking, the organizational intelligence of someone who manages a system where the inputs are voluntary human decisions and the outputs are medical emergencies that do not operate on any schedule. She knew her donors with the specificity of a coach who knows a roster, not just for what each player can do, but for who they are when the pressure comes. An AB-negative donor who appeared on the exact day of scheduling without reminder or incentive and who did so with the composed precision of someone for whom this appointment was not an inconvenience to be managed, but simply a thing that was being done, was, in Sandra's operational understanding, more valuable than any other single contributor in the center's inventory. When Margaret appeared for her second visit on exactly the scheduled date, Sandra noted it. When she appeared for a third and a fourth with the same consistency, Sandra began paying more deliberate attention. She did not approach Margaret immediately or attempt to engage her beyond the standard courtesies of the intake process. Sandra had been in this work long enough to understand that the most consistent givers are often people who are giving in exchange for something the center provides them that neither party would describe in those terms. What Columbus Regional provided Margaret Cole, Sandra came to understand over the course of those first months, was not the juice or the cookies or the small recognitions the staff offered regular donors. It was a place that required something specific from her and gave something specific back. A place with a clear and uncomplicated purpose. A place that did not ask her to explain herself or manage anyone else's feelings about her circumstances. A place where the only question that mattered was whether she had something to give. Margaret Cole always had something to give. That had always been the most reliable thing about her. Sandra began making small adjustments without announcing them. Margaret's paperwork was ready before she reached the desk. The screening room she was assigned to was the one with the morning light. The donor chair was the newer, more comfortable model. These adjustments were never mentioned. They were simply there, the way a thoughtful person makes space for another thoughtful person, quietly, without requiring the gesture to be named. Through the first year of donations, Margaret's life at the shelter settled into a structure that was modest but functional. She was awake before most of the other residents each morning. She was courteous to the staff and undemanding of anyone's attention. She had applied to 14 hospital nursing positions in her first weeks back in Columbus and received 2 responses, neither of which led to an interview. Because a 52-year-old nurse applying from a shelter address with a 2-year caregiving gap, however legitimate that gap was, and however clearly it was explained, was not a profile that the automated screening systems of major hospital networks were designed to recognize as promising. She was not discouraged in the way that produces paralysis. She was the kind of person who, when a door does not open, looks systematically for the next door and then the next. She reached out to former colleagues at Riverside Methodist. She applied to clinics and outpatient facilities where the screening processes were less automated and more human. She kept applying. And every 56 days, she walked 4 blocks to Broad Street and sat in the donor chair and gave what she had, because that at least was something uncomplicated and certain in a period of her life that had very little of either. In November of 2021, she secured a part-time position at the Northside Community Health Clinic, 12 hours a week doing intake assessments for walk-in patients. It paid less than a quarter of what she had earned at Riverside Methodist. It used roughly 20% of her actual professional capability. It was also, without qualification, the most important thing that had happened to her since Dennis died, because it got her back in a clinical setting, kept her license active, and gave her, 3 days a week, a reason to put on her professional clothes and be somewhere that needed what she knew how to do. She was still at Hope Harbor Shelter. She was still walking to Broad Street every 56 days. But she was beginning, carefully and without fully believing it yet, to feel like herself again. Not the full self, but the beginning of it. The recognizable beginning. Meanwhile, Raymond Voss was running into walls. His lead investigator had reported back within 48 hours of Lily's discharge that the federal privacy protections surrounding blood donor identity were, through conventional legal channels, essentially impenetrable. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act protected a blood donor's identity with the same force it protected any medical patient's privacy. The blood center would not and legally could not provide donor information. The hospital had no access to that information and no ability to compel its disclosure. Raymond absorbed the information and told Frank Dellinger to find another angle. What followed was 14 months of work by a forensic supply chain analysis firm, led by a former Department of Justice accountant named James Kellerman, who had spent 12 years tracking pharmaceutical products through complex institutional systems in the context of federal fraud investigations. The principle of the methodology was this: a donor's identity is protected by HIPAA, but the logistics of the blood product itself are not. Transport manifests, regional dispatch records, inventory movement documentation, insurance audit trails, all of these track the physical movement of a blood unit from origin through every transfer point to the receiving facility, and none of them contain donor identity information. But all of them together, analyzed with sufficient precision, point with statistical confidence to the specific center from which a unit originated. Kellerman spent 14 months building that analysis, filing document requests through proper channels, consulting compliance attorneys at every step, and produced in July of 2022 a report identifying Columbus Regional Blood Center as the most probable source of the AB-negative units used in Lily's transfusion, with a confidence level of 88%. Raymond read the report and told Kellerman to keep going. The further 14 months that followed narrowed the picture to a single probable donor. By cross-referencing the timing and volume of AB-negative transfers from Columbus Regional against the anonymized donation patterns in the center's inventory records, Kellerman's team built a statistical profile that matched the transfer timeline with a precision no random distribution could explain. A civil research petition filed through the Ohio courts after 7 months of legal process, which itself required 7 months of preparation and filing and review, granted access to a limited partial disclosure from the center's donor records, a first initial, a partial surname, and a mailing address. The address was a post office box registered to a shelter on 4th Street in Columbus. The partial name was M. Cole. Kellerman called Raymond Voss on a Tuesday evening in November of 2023. Raymond was on a transatlantic flight returning from Frankfurt when the voicemail arrived. He listened to it 3 times sitting on the tarmac at JFK after the plane landed in his seat, while the cabin emptied around him. He called Kellerman from the car on the way to his apartment on the Upper East Side and gave one instruction: run the full name against public records tonight. Kellerman called back 2 hours later. Raymond was inside his apartment by then, standing at the window looking at the street. Margaret Cole, registered nurse, Ohio State Board of Nursing, license active. Former employer, Riverside Methodist Hospital, trauma ward. Current address, Hope Harbor Shelter, 4th Street, Columbus, Ohio. Previous address, Elm Ridge Drive, foreclosure completed September 2021. Spouse, Dennis Allen Cole, deceased March 2021. Raymond Voss stood at the window of his apartment for 23 minutes after the call ended. His driver, who was waiting outside, received no instruction. The apartment was quiet. He was thinking about his mother in Scranton, the nurse who had worked 31 years in a profession the country depended on and compensated inadequately, who had never made enough to retire without worry, who had given everything she had to the work and received back from the system a pension that required careful management and a gratitude from her patients that did not appear on any balance sheet. He was thinking about the address on 4th Street and the address on Elm Ridge Drive and the foreclosure completed in September of 2021 and what it cost a person to walk 4 blocks to a blood center 11 days after their husband died and sit down in a chair and give what they had for a stranger. He was thinking about all of it in the same frame of understanding and finding that the frame was almost too small to hold it. He stood at the window for 23 minutes. Then he went to his desk and booked a flight to Columbus, Ohio, under the name Robert Vance, for a Thursday morning in December. He packed 1 bag. He told no one where he was going. He got on the plane. He landed in Columbus on a cold December morning, took a cab to a hotel near downtown that was comfortable without being conspicuous, ate breakfast without tasting it, took another cab to within 2 blocks of Grace Community Church on 5th Street, and walked the last 2 blocks with his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath visible in the cold air. He had confirmed the previous evening that Grace Community served a Thursday morning meal and that Margaret Cole was on the volunteer roster. He stood outside the church for a moment before pushing through the door. The hall was in the process of being cleaned. The meal service had ended perhaps 15 minutes earlier. Volunteers moved through the room, stacking chairs and wiping surfaces with the easy familiarity of people who have done this together many times. At the table nearest the kitchen door, a woman in a gray sweatshirt had her back to the entrance and was wiping down the table surface in long, even strokes, working with the thoroughness of someone who does this task the same way every time, regardless of whether anyone is watching. Raymond Voss stood in the doorway and looked at her for approximately 30 seconds. He said later, in the only conversation he ever allowed to be partially described, that he stood there because he needed a moment to hold all of it in the same frame of understanding and found, as he had found at the window of his apartment, that the frame was almost too small. He walked to the table anyway. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked up with the composed, courteous attention she extended to everyone who approached her in that room. She did not recognize him. He had expected that. He said his name. She heard it without visible recognition. He told her about April of 2021. He told her about Lily. He told her about New York Presbyterian and the blood type and the emergency dispatch and the 14 months of forensic analysis and the 3 years of legal process and the 3 weeks he had spent sitting with her name in a file before he could figure out how to be in the same room with her. He spoke slowly, without rushing, the way a person speaks when they have been carrying something for a long time and have finally arrived at the place where they can set it down. The room continued its quiet activity around them. The volunteer near the kitchen glanced over once and then looked away, sensing without being told that the conversation at that table required a certain kind of space. When Raymond finished, the silence lasted long enough to be its own statement. Margaret Cole looked at him across the folding table. She set down her cloth. She said, "I didn't do it for anyone specific. I just thought somebody might need it." Then she picked up the cloth and went back to wiping down the table. Raymond Voss did not stand up and leave. He sat at that table for 2 hours and 4 minutes. He asked about Dennis, not the medical facts, but the man himself, who he had been, what they had built together over 23 years, what it had meant and what it had cost, and what kind of person you had to be to give the way Margaret had been giving in the 11 days after Dennis died, and for 3 years beyond that. He asked about the trauma ward and the overnight shifts and what it is like, after 22 years of being the steadiest person in the room when everything is going wrong, to find yourself in a room where the situation going wrong is your own life. He asked about the boarding house on Schrock Road and the community health clinic and what her mornings looked like now and where she was trying to get to. He listened to her answers in the way he had, since Lily was born, been practicing to listen, not as an information-gathering exercise, but as a genuine act of reception, taking in what was being said and letting it mean something before he responded. Margaret answered him without embellishment and without minimizing, saying what was true in the direct, undecorated way that was simply how she communicated. Near the end of those 2 hours, Raymond asked her what she needed. Not what he could give her, what she needed. She sat with the question for a long moment. Then she said, "A reason to get up in the morning that isn't just about me." Raymond looked at her across the folding table and felt, in the specific way that a person who has been paying close attention to the right things for long enough sometimes feels, that he understood exactly what she meant and exactly what it would take. He said he thought he could do something about that. She said he didn't have to. He said he knew. They sat quietly for a moment. Then she went back to wiping down the table, and he sat there watching her for another moment before he stood up, thanked her, and walked out of the church into the December cold. The 6 months that followed were, by the account of Dr. Patricia Hale, who was inside them, some of the most focused and most careful work the Voss Foundation had ever undertaken. Raymond did not move quickly, which was contrary to his nature, and which he managed by understanding that moving quickly here would be a way of serving his own need to act rather than Margaret's actual need, which he had been given very clear information about at that folding table in the church basement, and which required a response that was more precise than speed. He called Patricia Hale and gave her one instruction: have 2 conversations with Margaret Cole before you come to me with a plan, because I want the plan built around what she actually has and what she actually needs, not around what is easy to provide or impressive to announce. Patricia Hale had 2 conversations with Margaret and called Raymond back and said, "I am not looking at a woman who needs to be helped into something. I am looking at a woman who already knows exactly what needs to be done and who has the experience and the character to do it if the structural obstacles are removed." Raymond said, "Remove them." The Cole Nursing Residency Program was announced in the spring of 2024. It was established as a national initiative operated through the Raymond and Lily Voss Foundation, providing full scholarship funding, housing assistance, professional reentry support, mentoring, and employment placement services to registered nurses across the United States who had experienced housing instability or financial hardship as a result of caregiver responsibilities or medical debt. The eligibility criteria were built with a precision that reflected intimate knowledge of the specific gap in the system that had swallowed Margaret Cole, the gap between what a dedicated healthcare professional's life should be protected against and what it is actually protected against when everything goes wrong at once. The program was named the Cole Nursing Residency Program. The Foundation's public announcement was a single paragraph describing the program's purpose and eligibility criteria. No origin story, no precedent, no photograph, just a name. And one woman in Columbus, Ohio, who understood when she read it the full weight of every word it contained. Margaret Cole was appointed inaugural director of the program in June of 2024. She had been sitting at her desk at the Northside Community Health Clinic when she read the announcement on her computer screen, and the volunteer working near her that morning later said she went very still for a long time and did not respond to 2 attempts to get her attention. When she finally looked up, she took out her phone and sent a text to a number she had been given in a church basement in Columbus in December. The text said, "You didn't have to do that." The reply came back in under 2 minutes. It said, "I know." She moved into a 1-bedroom apartment 2 blocks from Riverside Methodist in July, a place with morning light through the kitchen window and a small desk in the bedroom, and a framed photograph on that desk of her and Dennis at a backyard barbecue that used to be wrapped in plastic inside a canvas bag. She went to work every morning. She returned calls from nurses in 11 states who had applied in the program's first intake cycle. She built the mentoring curriculum with the specificity of someone who knows exactly what people in crisis actually need versus what institutions typically assume they need, because she had been both the person providing the care and the person needing it, and the knowledge that comes from being both is not available at any other price. Dr. Patricia Hale said, in 20 years of nonprofit healthcare management, she had not encountered a more effective program director. Margaret Cole was also, more than incidentally, genuinely happy in a way she had not been since before Dennis got sick. Not performed happy, not managing happiness as a professional posture. Quietly, unspectacularly, completely happy, in the way that people are happy when their life makes sense to them again and they have stopped being surprised that it does. She still donates blood at Columbus Regional Blood Center every 56 days. She still walks there, though the walk from the apartment on Denton Avenue is longer than it was from the boarding house on Schrock Road, because the walk gives her time to think and she has always done her best thinking on foot. She still declines the cookies. Sandra Okafor, who received the full story from Margaret in a conversation in her office on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 2024, sat very still for a long time after Margaret finished and then said something she had been formulating without knowing she was formulating it for 15 years of running a blood center. She said the supply that saves the life is only there because someone built it. And the person who built it almost never knows who it saved. And that does not stop them from coming back. The not knowing and the coming back anyway, that is the thing. That is the whole thing. Margaret Cole came back 36 times, not because she knew the outcome, because she believed there would be one. Lily Voss is 12 years old. She is healthy and growing and currently in the middle of a sustained investigation into marine biology that has produced a steady stream of book recommendations arriving in Raymond's direction that he is working through with the genuine effort of a father who understands that keeping up with his daughter's curiosity is one of the best investments he can make with his time. She does not yet know the full story of April 2021 or who made it possible for her to be 12 years old and asking her father to read about the ocean. Raymond has said he will tell her when he knows she is ready. He will know when he sees it. He has been watching her closely enough for 12 years to trust his own judgment about the right moment. When he tells her, he will tell her about Margaret. He will tell her about the shelter on 4th Street and the blood center on Broad Street and the donated coat and the canvas bag and the 36 donations and the February snowstorm. He will tell her what Margaret said at the folding table in the church basement, that she did not do it for anyone specific, that she just thought somebody might need it. He will tell Lily that he wants her to understand the full weight of that. The weight of giving something real, repeatedly, without expectation of return or confirmation of outcome, in the middle of the hardest period of your own life, for a person you will never meet, in a world that will not notice. He will tell her that the people who do that quietly and consistently are holding the world together in ways that are invisible until the moment they are not, and that she owes her life to one of them, and that what she does with that knowledge is one of the most important questions she will ever answer. He believes she will answer it well. He has been watching her long enough to believe that without reservation. There is something this story demands of the people who hear it that goes beyond admiration for Margaret Cole, though admiration is entirely appropriate and entirely deserved. What it demands is harder. It demands that you look honestly at what America does with the people who spend their lives in service to the rest of us, the nurses and the caregivers and the people who show up in rooms that most of us never see and do the work that keeps the system running and who are compensated and protected and caught when they fall in ways that are nowhere near adequate to what they give. Margaret Cole spent 22 years on a trauma ward giving everything she had to the worst moments of other people's lives. She spent 3 more years giving everything the law permitted her to give to strangers whose names she would never know. And the system that she had served and sustained and contributed to her entire adult life handed her a shelter cot and a canvas bag when her own worst moment came. That is not a comfortable fact. It is the fact that sits underneath all the other facts in this story. And it does not resolve because Margaret Cole now has an apartment with morning light and a job that uses everything she is. It does not resolve because the gap that swallowed her is still open and is still swallowing people, today, right now, quietly, without anyone making a documentary about it. The Cole Nursing Residency Program is a meaningful and well-built response to that gap. It is not a solution to the system that produced the gap. And this story, which is extraordinary in its specific details and entirely ordinary in its underlying structure, deserves to be heard with both of those things in mind at the same time. What I want to leave you with is a single image, not the foundation announcement. Not the apartment with the morning light. Not even the church basement and the folding table. The image I want to leave you with is this. A woman on a Tuesday morning in March of 2021, 11 days after her husband died, walking 4 blocks through cold Ohio air to a building she had never been in before, to give what she had to someone she would never meet. No audience, no recognition, no confirmation that it would matter to anyone. No reason by any external measure to do it at all. Just a belief, carried quietly, that somebody out there might need it. That is where this entire story begins. That is where everything that followed comes from. And the reason that image matters, the reason it will stay with you if you let it, is not because what Margaret Cole did was superhuman. It is because it was not. It was a decision available to any person at any time. A decision about what you are going to do with what you have, even when what you have is almost nothing, even when the world is not watching, even when there is no promise of anything in return. She made that decision 36 times, and the world, without knowing it was doing so, needed her to. The world always needs someone to. The question this story leaves on the table, the one I think you will carry with you after this video ends, is a simple one. It is this. When it is your turn to make that decision and no one is watching and there is no reward waiting, what will you do? Tell me in the comments. Tell me what this story did to you. Tell me if it reminded you of someone in your own life who has been giving quietly in ways you have not fully acknowledged. Tell me what you would have said if you had been Raymond Voss at that table, or Margaret Cole hearing what her blood had meant to a child she had never seen. Tell me if it changed the way you are looking at something, even one thing, even slightly. I read every comment, every single one, and the conversations that happen beneath these videos are consistently the most thoughtful I encounter anywhere. If this story is worth sharing, share it today with someone who needs to hear it. I promise you, you know someone who does. And subscribe if you have not already, because next week we are telling the story of a man in Detroit who was declared legally dead by the state of Ohio in 2004 and who spent 11 years trying to convince every institution that structures a person's existence in this country, the courts, the banks, the government offices, the Social Security Administration, the insurance companies, that he was standing right there, alive, and that he needed his life back. It is one of the most maddening and most human stories I have found in years of doing this work, and you are going to want to see how it ends. I will see you there.